My own brother kicked me out of the bakery I built from scratch, then had the nerve to demand $8,000 in back rent. All while I was secretly paying every single bill that kept it running. You won't believe how I turned betrayal into a legacy and why I'd still light a candle for him today. Ethan Rivers wasn't the type to draw attention. At 33, he blended into the rhythm of the city like a melody most people couldn't name, but would hum instinctively. Tall, lean, with dark eyes that rarely gave away more than he intended, Ethan had the kind of presence that made you feel at ease without knowing why. He lived simply, spoke thoughtfully, and worked harder than most would ever guess. For him, routine wasn't dull, it was grounding. The soft buzz of a neon sign hummed against the gray morning sky. The hearth had been a part of Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood for as long as Ethan Rivers could remember. Its brick-red facade and hand-painted wooden sign stood in defiant contrast to the slick, ever-evolving coffee shops and brunch spots mushrooming nearby. This was a place that had soul, not the curated kind found on Instagram, but the quiet baked-in warmth of sourdough rising before dawn and cinnamon lingering in the air like memory. Ethan, 33. Locked the doors just as he had every morning for the past 3 years. His hands moved out of habit more than intention, flicking on the lights, checking the ovens, flipping the close sign. By the time the first pedestrian strolled by, coffee in hand, the smell of vanilla yeast and butter had already begun to seep onto the sidewalk. When his parents retired and embarked on their long-dreamed-of South American odyssey, Ethan had stepped in not out of ambition but obligation. They had built the hearth from scratch, and though they promised it was just a break, they hadn't returned. Phone calls were rare, emails even rarer. Somewhere in Patagonia or the Galapagos, they were living a dream they'd postponed for 3 decades. Ethan didn't begrudge them, but the weight of their absence had settled on his shoulders like flour on an apron, invisible at first, then impossible to ignore. The shop's finances were tight. The neighborhood was changing. Rents rose, foot traffic dipped. Ethan had learned to stretch every dollar. He cut his own hours, picked up late-night delivery shifts under a pseudonym, and sometimes skipped meals to keep the shop afloat. He never complained. Not to his parents, not to friends, especially not to Cheryl. Cheryl Morgan, his closest friend since undergrad, would have seen right through the cracks. She was the kind of person who remembered birthdays without Facebook reminders and showed up with soup before you even realized you were sick. But Ethan had built a wall of modesty so carefully that even Cheryl only saw glimpses of the storm inside. There was dignity in work, he told himself. There was honor in legacy. Each croissant folded at 4 a.m., every call to the utility company begging for one more extension, each repair to the leaky espresso machine. These were his quiet acts of devotion, not just to the shop, but to the memory of what it had once been, a warm, chaotic, sugar-dusted hub of family. Some days regulars came in just to talk. Mrs. Gonzalez, who'd lost her husband last fall, found comfort in Ethan's shy smile and blueberry muffins. Jamal, the music teacher from the local high school, dropped in before class, always paying with cash, and slipping a few extra dollars into the tip jar. These people didn't see Ethan's struggle, but they felt the love he poured into every pastry. Yet there were moments late at night when the windows steamed and the register barely broke, even when Ethan questioned everything. Was he preserving something worth saving? Or was he just afraid to let go of what his parents had left behind? He never voiced those fears aloud. He simply kept going. Because that's what responsible sons do. The day Logan walked back into his life, tall, tanned, and insufferably confident, all of that quiet struggle, that invisible labor, stood at risk. But that part of the story hadn't arrived yet. For now, Ethan stood behind the counter of the hearth, rolling dough with care, humming a forgotten tune, carrying the weight of a legacy he hadn't asked for but refused to let crumble. Behind the counters, among bags of flour and stacks of invoices, lived a man who carried burdens no one thanked him for, and still he baked. It was a Tuesday morning when Logan showed up, the sky outside pale and unforgiving. Ethan was finishing the first batch of almond croissants when the bell above the door chimed. He expected a regular, maybe Hannah with her iced chai, or Mr. Ellis from the hardware store. What he saw instead stopped him mid-sentence. Logan Rivers, his older brother by 2 years, stood in the doorway like a character from another life. He looked tanned and rested his linen blazer, unseasonably crisp sunglasses tucked into his collar like a magazine ad. His grin, that signature smug Rivers smirk, hadn't aged a day. "Little brother," Logan said, spreading his arms. "You've been holding down the fort, huh?" Ethan wiped his hands on a towel, stunned into silence. It had been nearly 4 years since Logan had made more than a passing phone call. He'd been off chasing startup dreams in Austin, maybe San Diego. Ethan had stopped keeping track. "What are you doing here?" Ethan asked finally, voice flat. Logan stepped inside like he owned the place. "I got word from Mom and Dad. Said it was time someone with a business mindset took the reins. You've done a good job, I'm sure, but they left things in my hands now." He reached into his leather satchel and pulled out a folded document, a supposed power of attorney form. It bore signatures, looked official at a glance, but the language felt off. Too vague, too conveniently timed. Ethan read it once, then again. "This isn't notarized. They couldn't get to a notary. Spotty signal in Peru, you know how it is." Logan replied with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. Ethan blinked. He didn't know what stunned him more, the audacity or the absurdity. After years of silence, Logan was claiming control over their parents' legacy with a single sheet of paper and a pocket full of arrogance. "I'm not looking to fight," Logan added, walking behind the counter as if it were his. "We'll make this transition smooth. You stay on maybe as head baker or assistant manager. We'll talk salary adjustments later." Ethan clenched his jaw. The idea of pushing back, demanding evidence, calling their parents directly bubbled under his skin. But something stopped him. Maybe it was fatigue, maybe the fear of blowing things up, or maybe it was the same trait that had kept him baking through broken machines and unpaid invoices, the instinct to avoid conflict at all cost. So he nodded, once, quietly. "Fine," Ethan said, "but I'm not signing anything until I talk to them." Logan's smirk faltered just for a breath, but it returned quickly. "Sure thing. In the meantime, I'll start getting up to speed. Don't worry, the place is in good hands." As Logan disappeared into the back room, Ethan stood alone at the counter, fists still dusted with flour, heart pounding with the weight of something he couldn't name yet. Over the next few days, Logan embedded himself into the hearth like mold under tile. He began by moving Ethan's desk from the office, claiming he needed space to organize operations. He called impromptu staff meetings, suggesting flashy rebranding plans that no one had asked for. Customers who'd once come in for Ethan's quiet charm now found themselves greeted by Logan's boisterous voice and unsolicited business cards. The regulars exchanged looks, whispered confusion, but said nothing. Ethan could feel the shift like a draft through an old window, subtle, chilling, inescapable. He tried to reach his parents, but the calls didn't connect. The one email that made it through came back with a vague response. "Let Logan try his ideas. He's excited. Give it a chance." Each day, Ethan folded dough and bit his tongue. Not because he agreed, but because he didn't yet know how to fight back. And somewhere beneath the scent of sugar and pastry, a storm was beginning to gather. Behind closed doors, Logan began making changes that reached deeper than paint or branding. He started asking for financial records, questioning long-standing supplier relationships. and suggesting cuts to the wages of part-time staff. His reasoning optimization. His tone patronizing. Ethan overheard Logan on the phone late one night speaking to someone about expanding into a franchise model. The words chilled him. The hearth wasn't a brand, it was a home, a memory, a soul. Turning it into a commodity felt like betrayal. When Cheryl stopped by one evening with a thermos of soup and her usual sharp smile, she noticed the strain in Ethan's voice before he even spoke. He hesitated to tell her, but eventually the dam broke slowly, painfully. She listened without interruption, eyes narrowing at every new detail. "This paper doesn't sound legitimate," she said. "You need to challenge this." Ethan sighed. "I don't want to blow it up. I just want to keep the place running." She reached across the table. "You can't heal what you refuse to confront." That night, Ethan didn't sleep. Instead, he stared at the ceiling of his tiny apartment above the bakery, the hum of the refrigerator below a metronome to his racing thoughts. Logan hadn't just returned. He had brought chaos disguised as leadership, and Ethan, for all his loyalty, couldn't keep pretending it would fix itself. Tomorrow, he decided he'd find out exactly what his parents had authorized. Not because he wanted a fight, but because he couldn't let the hearth become something unrecognizable. Sometimes the past doesn't just revisit you. It tries to rewrite everything you've stood for. And sometimes you have to decide whether to let it or stand your ground. The sun filtered weakly through the blinds of Ethan's apartment above the hearth, casting pale slats across a breakfast he couldn't eat. He'd barely touched his coffee. Downstairs, the bakery hummed with the muffled sounds of the morning rush. But today something was off. The voices were louder, the rhythm disrupted. Ethan descended the narrow stairs 2 at a time. As he reached the last step, he heard it, Logan's voice, booming with performative charm. Not in conversation with a customer, but into a camera. "Hey, everyone! Logan Rivers here, bringing you a behind-the-scenes look at what happens when a business is mismanaged to the brink of disaster," he announced to his phone, filming a live stream on social media. The screen displayed dozens of viewers and climbing. This is what happens when someone with no business acumen is allowed to run a shop unchecked. Ethan froze in the doorway. Logan turned the camera toward him without warning. And here he is, the man himself. Ethan Rivers, the face behind 3 years of failing profits and unpaid invoices. "But don't worry, folks, I'm stepping in to clean up the mess. What the hell are you doing?" Ethan's voice trembled with fury and disbelief. Logan didn't flinch. "Public relations, little brother. Transparency. The world loves a redemption arc. I'm just setting the stage." He ended the stream, flipping his phone over. "Let's get down to business." From a leather folder, Logan produced a new document, a lease agreement. "If you want to stay here, you'll need to sign this. Retroactive rent $8,000 a month. Due immediately. Otherwise, you can pack up." Ethan stared at the paper. "You're charging me rent. For the apartment I've lived in since I was 20. For the business I've been running." Logan shrugged. "New management, new rules. You're free to negotiate with my lawyer." "This is extortion," Ethan said, voice rising. "You can't just—" "I can," Logan cut in. "And I will. The property is under my control now. The bakery lease, the apartment, all of it. You've been squatting for free long enough." Cheryl arrived just as Ethan was thrown further into disbelief. She stood in the doorway, eyes wide. "What's going on?" Ethan opened his mouth, but Logan beat him to it. "We're resolving a tenant dispute." "Ethan's not contributing his share, so I've asked him to vacate." "That's not true," Cheryl snapped. "He's been carrying this place." Logan turned to her with a thin smile. "Not your business." An hour later, Ethan found himself standing on the sidewalk, his belongings in a duffel bag and cardboard box beside him. Logan had called in a locksmith. A security guard from a third-party firm stood at the door. Passers-by watched as if unsure whether they were witnessing a performance or a private crisis. Ethan kept his eyes down. Rain began to fall, a slow soaking mist that clung to his clothes and curled his hair. He stood under the bakery's awning for a few moments, staring at the window where he used to draw hearts with frosting for neighborhood kids. The smell of cinnamon and yeast drifted through the glass like a ghost. A homeless man shuffled past and paused. "They kick you out?" Ethan gave a small nod. The man offered a half-empty coffee. "Tough world. Want some?" Ethan took it. "Thanks." He sat on the curb, sipping lukewarm coffee from a stranger and watching his world disappear behind glass and bureaucracy. For the first time in years, he had no keys, no bed, no answers. Just the echo of betrayal, loud, sharp, and more personal than anything he'd ever known. Above him, the hearth buzzed with customers unaware of the cost of their morning scones. And Ethan, soaked and stunned, realized that sometimes the person who pushes you out isn't a stranger but someone who shares your blood, and that betrayal. It doesn't knock. It kicks the door open and changes the locks. Cheryl didn't ask questions when Ethan showed up at her doorstep, drenched duffel bag in one hand and exhaustion in his eyes. She just stepped aside and opened the door wider. Her apartment smelled like lavender and chamomile, a far cry from the yeast and coffee of the hearth. She handed him a towel and he dried off in silence. It was the first warmth he'd felt all day. "Couch is yours," she said softly. "Bathroom's down the hall. I made soup." He wanted to say thank you, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he nodded, sat heavily, and let the silence stretch between them like a bridge they both knew they'd eventually cross. Later that night, with the city lights blinking through the windows and the soup warming his hands, Ethan finally spoke. "He kicked me out," I saw Cheryl replied, "and I saw that live stream too. It's going viral." Ethan set the bowl down, eyes narrowing. "He humiliated me. Made it look like I was some incompetent freeloader." Cheryl pulled out her laptop and flipped it open. "I've been digging. That power of attorney document, it's a joke. Not notarized, no legal standing unless your parents directly signed it in front of a notary. And that lease he made you sign under duress, completely contestable." "I didn't sign it," Ethan muttered. She smiled. "Good. Then we've got something to work with." They spent hours combing through old emails, texts from his parents, and business records Ethan had managed to save before being locked out. Cheryl, ever meticulous, began building a timeline. She flagged inconsistencies, collected screenshots of Logan's public posts, and made a list of lawyers to contact the next morning. "Before we do anything else," she said, "you need to get stable. I'll help cover groceries and we'll find you some part-time work while we build a case. You're not alone, Ethan." He stared. "Why are you doing this?" She gave him a look that was part exasperation, part affection. "Because we've been friends for 15 years. Because I know what kind of man you are. And because Logan is a parasite who picked the wrong person to bully." For the first time since that rainy afternoon on the sidewalk, Ethan felt the faintest ember of hope. He began settling into Cheryl's guest room, a modest space filled with mismatched bookshelves and the soft hum of her old ceiling fan. Every morning she brewed coffee and left sticky notes on the fridge with little encouragements. "Today is a step forward," or "Justice is patient but persistent." While Cheryl worked during the day, Ethan took to walking. He wandered through old neighborhoods, applied for odd jobs, and even volunteered briefly at a local soup kitchen, the irony of it not lost on him. It reminded him how easily lives could unravel and how small acts of kindness could bind them back together. At night, he and Cheryl strategized. They created a digital folder titled Operation Hearthfire. Inside it, scanned receipts, witness statements from loyal customers, screenshots of Logan's comments, and notes from legal consultations. Cheryl's living room turned into a war room. One evening, Ethan received an email from his parents, short, vague, and unsettling. They seemed unaware of the full extent of Logan's actions, referencing his ambitious leadership and modernizing efforts. It was clear they had been fed a curated narrative. "This changes things," Cheryl said. "We'll need to reach them directly in person if possible." How, Ethan asked. "They're in South America with no solid contact." Cheryl didn't hesitate. "We'll find a way." Through it all, Ethan grappled with more than logistics. There were days he questioned himself, his passivity, his failure to foresee Logan's betrayal. But Cheryl's steady presence reminded him that healing wasn't linear, and courage often looked like quiet persistence. By the end of the month, Ethan had a part-time job as a barista in a small independent cafe run by a cheerful couple who valued his experience. It wasn't the hearth, but it gave him purpose. Sometimes rock bottom isn't the end. Sometimes it's the first solid thing you've stood on in years. And sometimes the light you need most comes from the friend who's been there all along, waiting with soup, a warm couch, and the strength you forgot you had. The first sign was the lights. One Thursday morning, just before the breakfast rush, the flickering began. Customers sipping coffee at the front tables blinked in confusion as the overhead bulbs dimmed and buzzed. Logan banged at the circuit panel in the back like a frustrated amateur, muttering something about ancient wiring. But the truth was more calculated. Ethan had stopped paying the utility bills. Not out of spite, but necessity. He still had access to the auto-pay accounts, utilities, supply vendors, service providers, all in his name. For years, he had quietly kept the hearth running by fronting those costs himself. Logan, in his arrogance, hadn't bothered to change the names or payment systems. He assumed control without the groundwork. So Ethan turned off the faucet. Electricity, gas, ingredients, trash removal, business insurance. Ethan ceased all payments with clinical precision. One by one, the pillars holding up Logan's paper kingdom crumbled. By Monday, deliveries had stopped. No flour, no eggs, no fresh fruit. The pastry case sat half empty, and Logan scrambled to explain the shortage to increasingly impatient customers. By Wednesday, the espresso machine sputtered and died. No one came to fix it. Technical issues, Logan said in another one of his impromptu live streams. He had started filming more often, trying to maintain the illusion of success. "We're undergoing some upgrades, investing in better infrastructure," he lied as the camera carefully avoided the growing trash heap out back and the dimmed lights overhead. But the regulars knew. They'd seen the change. The warmth had left. The soul of the hearth wasn't in the decor or the menu. It had always been Ethan. Customers left negative reviews. Former employees texted Ethan in disbelief. Cheryl monitored it all from her laptop like a general charting the collapse of an enemy camp. Then came the meltdown. Friday afternoon, with a line stretching out the door and no working register, Logan finally broke. Someone in line had asked loudly why they couldn't get a simple coffee anymore. Logan snapped. He pulled out his phone, went live, and began ranting. "This is sabotage," he cried. "My own brother is trying to ruin me. He's cut the power, canceled my shipments, slandered me online. I'm just trying to save this place." The comment section exploded. "You kicked him out. You forged papers. Where's the proof?" "Logan, bring Ethan back." For the first time, Logan's confident veneer cracked. His voice trembled. His eyes darted around the cafe like a cornered animal. He ended the live stream abruptly, but the damage was done. Clips went viral. Hashtags trended. "Justice for Ethan, Nair, save the hearth." That night, the lights went out for good. The power company, unpaid for 2 billing cycles, flipped the switch. The hearth sat in darkness, a shell of what it had once been. Ethan watched it all from Cheryl's couch, her hand on his shoulder. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. There was no triumph in watching something you loved collapse, even if it was in the hands of someone who didn't deserve it. but there was vindication. And for the first time since Logan returned, Ethan felt the scales begin to shift. Not out of revenge, but out of truth finally rising. And truth, he realized, had its own quiet power. It was Cheryl who made the call. One evening after dinner, as Ethan washed dishes in her kitchen and tried not to feel like a burden, she tapped the contact name on her phone. With a confident finality, Harold Langston. "Old family lawyer," she said over her shoulder. "Handled estates for decades. You need someone with institutional memory, someone who knows where the real paper trail lives." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You sure he'll remember us?" "He never forgets anything," she replied. "And more importantly, he's still sharp, still respected, and still loyal to your grandfather's intentions." Harold Langston met them in a quiet corner of his book-lined office. The smell of aged paper and worn leather thick in the air. He looked like he'd stepped out of another century, suspenders, silver-rimmed glasses, and a legal mind honed over 50 years. "Ah, Ethan," he said, peering over the rims. "You look just like your grandfather when he got stubborn. Let's talk." Cheryl laid out the situation with clinical precision. Logan's surprise return, the questionable power of attorney, the live streams, the eviction. Harold listened without interrupting. Then, with deliberate care, he opened a cabinet behind him. "I suspected something was amiss when I heard Logan's name surface in relation to the hearth," Harold said. "Your grandfather, Howard Rivers, anticipated conflict. That's why in 2010 he updated his will." He slid a folder across the table. Inside was the original notarized copy of Howard Rivers' last will and testament. The document was simple, clear, and devastating in its precision. "I leave the full rights, responsibilities, and ownership of the Hearth Bakery along with all associated property to my grandson, Ethan Thomas Rivers. I do so in confidence of his character, his care for our family legacy, and his humility in stewardship." Ethan stared at the paper, hands trembling. "I had no idea," he whispered. "No one did," Harold said. "Your parents never challenged it because they trusted you. Logan was left out for a reason." The next steps unfolded like chess. Cheryl immediately began the paperwork for a temporary restraining order, TRO, aiming to halt Logan's activities until the will could be properly enforced in court. Harold provided notarized copies of the will and an affidavit attesting to its validity. "We'll file tomorrow morning," Cheryl said, "and I'll go with you to court. No more playing defense." That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He sat in Cheryl's living room, the will in his lap, heart heavy, not with anger, but relief. It wasn't just about reclaiming the shop. It was about truth finally having weight. In the quiet, he whispered a thank you to his grandfather, a man who had seen beyond charm and ambition and chosen substance. Integrity. Family in the truest sense. In the days that followed, Cheryl and Ethan worked tirelessly. They assembled a comprehensive legal packet complete with sworn statements from former employees, local vendors, and even longtime customers who had witnessed Ethan's role in running the shop. Harold guided them on the legal intricacies while Cheryl handled logistics with the precision of a seasoned project manager. They interviewed witnesses who could attest to Ethan's years of dedication. A former baker who remembered his all-nighters before holidays. A supplier who described Ethan personally driving through snow to pick up a shipment. When the delivery truck got stuck, a retired neighbor who'd watched Ethan shovel the walk every morning. Their TRO request, filed at the county courthouse, quickly garnered attention. The filing included not only the 2010 will, but also evidence of Logan's mismanagement financial statements, showing plummeting revenue since his takeover, social media rants that undermined his credibility, and vendor complaints of unpaid bills. Harold accompanied them on filing day, dressed impeccably in a three-piece suit, his presence commanding respect even among younger legal staff. As they exited the courthouse, he placed a firm hand on Ethan's shoulder. "This isn't just about proving you're the rightful heir," he said. "It's about protecting what matters: your integrity, your family's name, and a legacy your grandfather poured his life into." After the filing, Cheryl helped Ethan prepare for the inevitable public attention. Together they wrote a quiet, dignified statement that Ethan would release only if asked, one that thanked the community, acknowledged the hardship, and gently clarified the truth. No accusations, no mudslinging, just facts and grace. That night, Cheryl made dinner: spaghetti and garlic bread, Ethan's comfort food. They toasted with cheap wine and laughed for the first time in weeks. But underneath it all, a sense of purpose simmered. Ethan wasn't just reacting anymore, he was reclaiming. Not just a business, a belief in himself. And the restoration of something sacred: trust, truth, and the power of standing tall against injustice. The courtroom was smaller than Ethan had imagined. It smelled faintly of wood polish and old paperwork, and the fluorescent lights above buzzed with soft static. But to him, it might as well have been a cathedral. This was where the truth would finally be spoken aloud. Beside him sat Cheryl, her notepad meticulously filled with bullet points and legal codes. Harold, dignified and steady, organized their exhibit folders on the table. Across the aisle, Logan fidgeted in his ill-fitting blazer eyes, scanning the nearly empty gallery. The preliminary hearing began promptly. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s named Judge Lillian Cortez, presided with quiet authority. She opened the floor with a calm but firm tone, outlining the matter at hand. Rightful ownership and control of the Hearth Bakery. Harold stood first. He began with the will. Clear, notarized, dated. The judge studied it carefully. Then came Ethan's testimony. He spoke with quiet conviction about his years managing the Hearth, about his parents' decision to retire, and how he kept the business alive. He produced receipts, payment logs, and email chains that showed he had been the sole party managing bills, suppliers, and maintenance. Cheryl queued up screenshots of Logan's live streams, the one where he accused Ethan of sabotage and the one where he broke down publicly, acknowledging the failure of operations. They played in silence, the only sound afterward being the judge's pen scratching against her notes. Then came the witnesses. Harold had arranged for two to appear in person: Mrs. Lawton, the retired school teacher who lived across from the Hearth, and Carlos, a delivery driver from the bakery's main supplier. Both spoke highly of Ethan's years of stewardship and described Logan's behavior as erratic and aggressive. Logan attempted a rebuttal. He stammered about modernizing the bakery and accused Ethan of undermining his leadership. But when Judge Cortez asked for documentation to support his claim to ownership, he hesitated. "There was a verbal understanding," Logan mumbled. "And where is the legal agreement or notarized document?" the judge pressed. He said nothing. Harold stood again, calm as ever. "Your Honor, in absence of any legal document presented by Mr. Logan Rivers, and in light of the 2010 will explicitly naming Ethan Thomas Rivers as the sole heir and rightful owner, we respectfully request the immediate enforcement of the will and the removal of Mr. Logan Rivers from the premises." The room went still. Judge Cortez looked from Logan to Ethan, then to the document in front of her. She folded her hands and spoke clearly. "This court finds the evidence presented to be both substantial and compelling. Mr. Ethan Thomas Rivers is recognized as the legal owner of the Hearth Bakery. I am issuing an immediate injunction requiring Mr. Logan Rivers to vacate the property and relinquish control." Cheryl exhaled sharply. Ethan closed his eyes, the verdict washing over him like warmth. Furthermore, the judge continued, "All assets, operational rights, and future decisions regarding the Hearth shall rest solely with Mr. Ethan Rivers. Court is adjourned." Logan slumped in his seat, stunned. Cheryl gave Ethan's arm a gentle squeeze. Harold, dignified as ever, offered a small nod. Outside the courthouse, a few community members had gathered. A local reporter asked for a statement. Ethan stepped forward, voice clear. "I didn't fight for ownership out of pride," he said. "I fought for a legacy for truth and for everyone who believed in what the hearth stood for. Thank you for standing with me." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the Seattle skyline, Ethan stood before the familiar facade of the hearth. The keys felt heavy in his palm, not with burden but with purpose. He was home. Justice, long overdue, had finally arrived. Not with fanfare, but with quiet, unwavering truth. And for the first time in a long while, the doors of the hearth would open again, this time under the rightful name. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the hearth alone. The early sun gleamed on the dusty windows, and silence filled the space where flower once danced in the air. He unlocked the front door and stepped into the bakery for the first time as its rightful owner. The place was a mess. Boxes were stacked haphazardly, expired goods sat neglected on shelves, and the scent of staleness lingered in the air. But Ethan smiled. He rolled up his sleeves and got to work. First came the cleaning. Days turned into weeks as Ethan, with help from Cheryl and a few old employees who returned with open arms, scrubbed every surface, repainted walls, and polished display cases. They rearranged the layout for better flow and reopened the community chalkboard that once held messages, recipes, and doodles from neighborhood kids. Ethan took time with each detail. He replaced flickering bulbs with warm lights, restored the wooden sign his grandfather carved by hand, and restocked shelves with carefully selected ingredients. The kitchen once again smelled of butter, cinnamon, and fresh dough. Word spread quickly. The bakery was back, and so was Ethan. Old customers returned with flowers, handwritten notes, and hugs. Some brought their children, now grown, who remembered Ethan's kindness from years past. Local journalists caught wind of the story. One headline read, "He lost everything, then took it back with grace." Ethan gave careful interviews. He didn't slander Logan, but focused on resilience, community, and gratitude. He shared his hopes for the hearth not just as a bakery, but as a gathering place for healing and celebration. Inspired by Cheryl, Ethan launched weekend baking classes. Parents and kids kneaded dough together. Seniors traded cookie recipes. Couples on first dates laughed over frosting mishaps. The classes filled quickly, often booked out weeks in advance. Each Saturday, Ethan held open hearth nights, community potlucks, where people could bring food, share stories, and reconnect. Laughter echoed through the bakery like it had in his childhood. Ethan also partnered with local schools, offering internships for culinary students and donating unsold goods to shelters. He installed a pay-it-forward board, allowing customers to buy drinks and pastries for strangers in need. Meanwhile, Logan faced consequences of a different kind. Online backlash intensified. Former fans turned critics dissected his lies in live streams. He issued a half-hearted apology online, which only fueled further criticism. Memes circulated mocking his fall from grace. Podcasts dissected the case, using it as an example of entitlement and the power of community to right a wrong. Logan disappeared from social media for weeks, but Ethan never responded. He let his actions speak louder than any rebuttal. One rainy evening, a woman entered the hearth and placed a small clay angel on the counter. "You don't know me," she said, "but my son worked here last summer. He was struggling and you never judged him." This place gave him confidence. Ethan nodded, speechless, and added the figurine to the growing shrine of gratitude and gifts behind the register. In time, Ethan expanded the menu, introduced locally sourced ingredients, and hosted fundraisers for neighborhood schools and shelters. The hearth became more than a bakery again. It was a sanctuary. One afternoon, Ethan found an old journal from his grandfather in a forgotten drawer. On the last page, written in elegant cursive, was a line: "The real legacy we leave behind isn't brick and flour, it's how we lift those around us." Ethan kept it framed by the register, and every time a new customer walked through the door, he greeted them the same way: "Welcome home." It was a gray Tuesday afternoon when Logan returned. Ethan was behind the counter finishing a batch of lemon scones when Cheryl walked in, her eyes flickering toward the front door. Logan stood there, soaked from the drizzle outside, no camera in sight, no entourage, just a folded piece of paper in his hand. "I just want to talk," Logan said. The room fell silent. Even the clink of a spoon from a nearby table seemed to pause. Ethan wiped his hands, nodded, and led Logan to the back, where the noise of the kitchen was a soft hum behind them. They sat across from each other at the old break room table, the same one where Ethan once balanced ledgers late into the night. "I messed up," Logan began, voice cracking. "I didn't think things would go that far. I was angry, jealous. I thought I was owed something." Ethan stayed quiet. He studied his brother, the lines of guilt on his face, the twitch in his hands. "I came in here with pride and entitlement and no understanding of what you'd built," Logan continued. "And when it started falling apart, I blamed you instead of facing myself." He unfolded the paper, a letter of apology, handwritten. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted you to hear me say it." Ethan took the letter, read a few lines, and placed it gently on the table. "I appreciate you saying that," he said, his voice even. "But this isn't something words alone can fix." Logan nodded. "I know. I lost more than a bakery," Ethan continued. "I lost trust, my home, my peace. You used the one thing we both inherited, this place, and weaponized it. That's not easily undone." Logan's eyes welled, but he didn't interrupt. "I've worked hard to rebuild this place," Ethan said, "and not just the walls and ovens, but the soul of it. You don't just get to walk in and erase what happened." "I'm not asking for that," Logan replied. I needed to own it, publicly, privately. I'm working with a therapist now, trying to make sense of who I've been." Ethan nodded slowly. There was something different in Logan's tone, not performative, not pitiful, just quiet honesty. "That's a start," Ethan said. "But forgiveness is a process. It's not instant, and it's not a guarantee." "I understand." Logan stood. "Thank you for listening." As he left, Cheryl stepped into the room. "You okay?" Ethan looked at the letter, then out the window where Logan disappeared down the street. "I don't know if I can ever fully forgive him," he said. "But maybe today was a first step." That evening, Ethan lit a candle in the window, a tradition his grandfather used to keep. A symbol of warmth, of leaving the light on even when the road back is long. Forgiveness, he was learning, didn't mean forgetting. It meant choosing not to carry the weight forever. And that was enough for now. In the following days, Ethan revisited Logan's letter more than once. Each time he read a different layer of truth behind the apology, the shame, the regret, the self-awareness beginning to emerge. Cheryl noticed the shift too. "You're more centered," she said one morning over coffee. "Like a weight lifted." "I don't know if I'll ever be completely okay with what happened," Ethan admitted, "but I don't want to stay angry forever. That's a weight I carry, not him." He placed the letter in a wooden box under the counter among mementos from customers and notes of gratitude from students in his baking classes. Not erased, but held, remembered. When a journalist followed up asking about the confrontation with Logan, Ethan declined to comment. "This story isn't about retribution," he said. "It's about repair." And slowly, through quiet evenings at the shop, through each story shared over cinnamon buns and each act of kindness exchanged, The community helped Ethan heal. His life, like the bakery, was still standing, not unchanged, but restored. And restoration, he had come to understand, was more powerful than revenge. The hearth had weathered many seasons, but now it stood renewed, not only with a fresh coat of paint and reorganized shelves, but with a new soul. Ethan had become its steward not by force or inheritance alone, but through resilience, compassion, and relentless effort. One quiet morning, as he stood behind the counter preparing coffee for the early birds, Ethan stared at the sign above the window. The hearth, it read elegant and simple, yet it no longer spoke fully to what the bakery had become. With Cheryl's help, he designed a new nameplate. When it was unveiled later that month, it read, "The Hearthstone." Stone means legacy, Ethan explained during the reopening ceremony. Something that endures. The hearth is where we gather, but the hearthstone is what holds the heat. The change was subtle but profound. The new name symbolized a transformation, a place rooted in family yet redefined by chosen community and personal integrity. Local news outlets covered the symbolic relaunch. Former patrons returned with nostalgia and joy. Young bakers now looked to Ethan as both mentor and friend. To mark the transformation, Ethan began a new initiative called Bakers of Tomorrow, a scholarship program that offered hands-on training and mentorship for at-risk youth. He partnered with nonprofits, opened his kitchen after hours for workshops, and mentored with patience the next generation of pastry artisans. The hearthstone became not only a haven for warmth and comfort, but also a crucible of new beginnings. One evening, while closing up, Ethan found a letter slipped under the door. The handwriting was familiar, unmistakably his mother's. He opened it slowly. "Dear Ethan, we followed everything from afar. Your father and I saw the headlines, the interviews, and the new sign. But none of that compared to what we felt reading your story in the paper and hearing from neighbors who said you saved more than a bakery. We made mistakes by leaving too quickly, by trusting blindly. But we've watched how you turned pain into purpose and how you kept this family's heart beating. We're so proud of the man you've become. You are the best of both of us. Love, Mom and Dad." Tears welled up in Ethan's eyes as he folded the letter and placed it in the same box where Logan's apology lived, symbols of closure, recognition, and forward motion. In that moment, Ethan felt a surge of validation, not just from his parents, but from life itself. His past no longer defined him, it empowered him. As spring rolled in, the hearthstone became a symbol across Seattle for hope and healing. Other small businesses came to Ethan for advice. Schools asked him to speak. His story had quietly touched many, not for its drama, but for its sincerity. He wrote a column for a local journal titled "The Science of Scones and the Art of Starting Over, Blending Humor with Hard-Earned Wisdom." Readers responded with letters of gratitude and stories of their own hardships and recoveries. On a Sunday evening, as dusk painted the sky in soft oranges and blues, Ethan stood at the front door watching people linger around the shop, sharing stories over pie. A child skipped past laughing, a scone in hand. An older couple shared coffee by the window. Cheryl waved from the community table surrounded by recipe books and students from the weekend class. Ethan turned the sign on the door from open to closed, but he left the lights on. The bakery was quiet, warm. Home. And as he stood in that quiet glow, he realized he wasn't just keeping the fire alive. He had become the hearthstone itself, steady, enduring, and full of light for others to gather around.